So Prigozhin's dead, and nobody has any idea what's going to happen with Wagner going forward, right? Some interesting predictions out there. An article just came out in the New York Times titled, "After Prigozhin's Death, a high-stakes scramble for his empire." Now, if this was like one person throwing out their opinion with no sources, I wouldn't cover it, wouldn't really bring it up. It'd be maybe interesting to read. But in this case, they actually talked to a lot of different people, both in the U.S. and Europe and Russia. I mean, they say interviews in this article with more than a dozen current and former officials in Washington, Europe, Africa, and Russia, as well as 4 Russians who worked for Mr. Prigozhin, portray a tug of war over his assets among major players in Russia's power structure. So it's talking to enough people that I feel like this was worth diving into and sharing what I thought was interesting here as to what the heck this Wagner organization is going to look like in the future. Now, starting out, they talk with a guy named Maxim Shugalei, Shugalei, who is a political consultant for Prigozhin. And I thought this added some really good context for how we're thinking about Wagner as a whole. He says, quote, "Wagner's not just about the money. It's a kind of religion. It's unlikely that the structure will totally disappear. For me, this is impossible." And I think it's true. I mean, if you've followed Wagner and some of the conversations inside of their organization, how they talk about the Russian Ministry of Defense and the regular Russian troops, it's been broader than just a group of mercenaries that are exclusively out there for pay. There's a level of pride within Wagner that's noticeable from the outside, right? When you talk to, I mentioned this before, but the Russian channel or the YouTube channel 1420 that interviews Russians on the streets, there were a couple interviews where they talked to kids about Wagner, and they said, like, those guys are cool, right? They're different. They're the ones who get things done. There's just a perception about Wagner that I think is internalized within the organization. I think religion, when he says it's a kind of religion, is probably on the extreme end. I'm not sure I would necessarily put it that far, but it's much more than just a couple guys getting together for a paycheck. Right, so we have to keep that in consideration. Continuing on, they say Prigozhin's paramilitary group was Russia's most effective fighting force in Ukraine in the last year, and its dissipation raises questions about Russia's ability to mount new offensives. His media group, complete with an online troll farm, was instrumental in undercutting democratic institutions around the world. All right, Wagner has played a big role in the war. I think they missed it, to be blunt. I'm not going to try to tiptoe around this. I think a lot of what they had here is wrong. His paramilitary group was Russia's most effective fighting force in Ukraine in the last year. Maybe. I mean, there were a lot of things. Bakhmut got a lot of the attention, but that was also an incredibly deadly fight. Wagner and Prigozhin lost a ton of people to take Bakhmut, and now those lines, they weren't able to dig in as effectively as possible when they handed off to the Ministry of Defense troops, and now some of those positions have been retaken, and Bakhmut is looking to be, and has been now for a few months, a center of the fight. So, yes, Wagner took Bakhmut, they took Soledar. Most of the other Russian forces weren't attacking. There were some kind of weak, rough attempts down in Volodar that just looked awful, thrown together at the last minute. So, in that sense, yes, Wagner was the most effective. I think this makes it seem like they are, a more elite group than anyone else in the Russian military. I don't know that that's necessarily true. And that plays into the second part. Its dissipation raises questions about Russia's ability to mount new offensives. Totally different. I don't think it has anything to do with Russia's ability to mount new offensives. The Wagner group, when they're in and around Bakhmut, I want to say 50,000 on or about. That's the Russian military has a lot more than that across the country. You can't completely remove it and say it means nothing. Right, that manpower does mean something. That capability does mean something. But to suggest that Wagner's removal from the battlefield means that Russia as a whole can't carry out any sort of offensive going forward, I think that's misrepresenting kind of the role Wagner was playing in the war. Russia will likely, they are right now, carrying out relatively small but still counterattacks in the northeastern portion of the country. So I think that's hyping up Wagner a little more than they actually deserve. And then finally, this online troll farm, instrumental in undercutting democratic institutions around the world. I think that's been an underreported aspect of Wagner's operations. They have the Internet Research Agency that was a Prigozhin-run company inside of Russia that got a lot of attention, especially after recent U.S. elections. But what they do in their media groups, their disinformation campaigns in Africa is substantial. It is a major component of how Wagner operates in some of these parts of the world. And I just feel like that has really played second fiddle to the Battle of Bakhmut. Like all of a sudden that has been the thing that gets all the attention. All of these other aspects of what Wagner does have kind of fallen by the wayside. And quite frankly, some of it might be more important on the world stage, all things considered. They continue saying, nowhere does Wagner's operation now carry more value for Russia than in African countries, including Libya and the Central African Republic, where its mercenaries have gained trust and wealth by propping up strongmen and autocrats. And it's an area that the U.S. isn't really paying a lot of attention to, right? We've got all of our sensors, all of our focus on the Middle East for a long time, and now increasingly Eastern Europe with Russia. And Russia they've put a lot of time and energy and resources into Africa, and Wagner's kind of been leading the charge there. But what they're going to get into here in this article is how that aspect of the Wagner empire, because Prigozhin's making a ton of money down there, is falling apart and starting to lean more likely heading under direct control of the Russian government. They say Western officials briefed on confidential intelligence assessments say 2 Russian spy agencies, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, and the Military Intelligence Agency, the GRU, are vying to take over key aspects of Prigozhin's operations. 2 officials from different governments said that the SVR was likely to absorb Wagner's propaganda and online disinformation outlets targeting foreign countries, while the Defense Ministry and the GRU could take in Wagner's mercenary operations. Not crazy if you think about that split. It kind of fits. And it does look like, again, I think most of the focus in the news is on the paramilitary aspect. That's what got the most attention in Ukraine. That's what people are thinking about in Belarus. They're the ones up there training. And you see images and videos of their soldiers training troops in Africa and at times carrying out offensive or defensive operations against Islamic State and terrorist organizations there. So the focus is going to be on the gunslingers, right, and the fighters. But the information piece, the propaganda, that it makes sense that would fall under Russian SVR. Now, of course, following the death, this article kind of tracks the timeline, right? And they get to the death of Prigozhin, and they say that the Kremlin declined to comment on the future of Mr. Prigozhin's empire. Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, said, quote, "This is none of our business at all, and we are not dealing with it in any way." So one of the interesting aspects with Wagner is that they have kind of operated as this non-state actor, but they've been very, very closely tied in with the Russian state since day one, right? I mean, when you look at some of the equipment they were operating in Ukraine, right? These guys had T-90s and BMP-3s, some of the most advanced, they had helicopters, aircraft. They had some of the most advanced Russian equipment that regular Russian army units didn't have yet. So they're very, very connected within the Russian government. So it'll be interesting to see as this Wagner empire kind of is divided up, how close of a role, how obvious and how clear of a role does Russia decide to play in this going forward? Because that was, one of the drawbacks over the last 6 to 12 months, I would say, is for a long time, the West, the United States, we've had a hard time figuring out how we're going to deal with this Wagner group that's not overtly tied to Russia, but that's just out the window, right? After they started fighting alongside, and in some cases under Ministry of Defense forces, like the veil's lifted. Wagner is a part of the Russian state. So it'll be interesting to see if Russia kind of just says, whatever, now you're part of the Russian state, we got it. Or if they still try to kind of maintain this cloud of secrecy that it's a private organization, or entirely private organization, I should say. They continue saying that members of Russia's ruling elite were puzzled over why the Kremlin was allowing Mr. Prigozhin to attack the country's top brass so viciously and publicly. 2 people close to the Kremlin said that Mr. Putin appeared to have his own vision of how to manage the warlord, Prigozhin, and his aides seemed powerless to influence it. That makes sense. I mean, we've been looking for answers as to why this hot dog vendor, a guy who grew up a hot dog vendor, now runs a paramilitary organization in Ukraine, is able to say some of the things that he was saying, right? People much lesser than him, much quieter than him, with much smaller platforms than him, were jailed for speaking out like that. So every time Prigozhin is putting out these videos, just straight attacking Russian leadership, it was surprising. And so it fits the argument here that Putin had his own vision on how to manage him, and nobody could interdict that. Nobody could change that and say, hey, this isn't going according to plan. They say that when Prigozhin aborted his uprising back in June, the march to Moscow, having accepted a deal with the Kremlin, it appeared his career was finished, even if he was lucky to have escaped with his life. But a key question was what would happen with his mercenary fighters. As Kremlin officials mold their future, they sent several thousand to Belarus to park them there, according to a Western official, providing time to sort out which senior officials were complicit in Mr. Prigozhin's rebellion and to reinforce Moscow's defenses against any future attack. So again, with any one of these things, you got to be careful with any of the information coming out of this conflict, no matter who it's coming from, and kind of dissect how much does it pass the common sense test, kind of. So if you remember, right after the failed mutiny, there was a lot of talk. I remember seeing a lot of conversations that Wagner was going to Belarus because they were the most effective Russian fighting force, and they were going to attack Ukraine from the north. It didn't make sense. Ukraine has reinforced their northern border with Belarus. The Wagner forces that went there, I mean, it was, even if it was half of the full Wagner force, you're talking about 20,000. I think it was less than that. So is Russia realistically going to take those 20,000? Screw it. We'll say the full Wagner force of 40,000. Do we really think that this Wagner force of 40,000 against a now reinforced and heavily watched and guarded border with Ukraine is going to have more success than the initial invasion with regular Russian army units, attack aviation, air superiority to a degree? Like, no, it didn't make sense that that's what they were being moved up there for. The idea of parking them there, getting them out of Russia, just to make sure this thing doesn't happen again, while figuring out who was involved in this mutiny, that does kind of make sense. Doesn't mean that this commentary doesn't mean that this statement from a senior official is entirely true, but at least passes that test. Continuing on, they talk about how Russia tried to kind of do away with Prigozhin, erase the memory, if you will, a la Stalin. They said state television began to tarnish Mr. Prigozhin's image. One outlet, for instance, showed a van stuffed with boxes of cash in a lavish residence, complete with a helicopter, all said to belong to Mr. Prigozhin. And this is part of a campaign to say, this guy's not just some humble servant out here trying to do the best for Russia. He is enriching himself at every opportunity and is incredibly wealthy. So that was a little bit of that. And then they said, after working to discredit Mr. Prigozhin, the Kremlin tried to get the Russian public to forget about him. On June 30th, Prigozhin's media conglomerate, the Patriot Media Group, announced it was shutting down days after its websites were blocked by Russia's internet censor. Then, I was laughing because this next part, like they did a pretty good job of just shutting down any talk about Prigozhin. Say, according to a New York Times analysis of Russian television transcripts compiled by this nonprofit G-Delt, Mr. Prigozhin disappeared from the airwaves. On most days between July 13th and August 22nd, his name was not mentioned at all in any of the four leading state-controlled channels. I think the first read of that, you might think that that's, again, I made the joke kind of Stalin-esque of forgetting about this guy, but I can also understand, or erasing the guy, but I can also understand the argument inside of Russia, like, we don't need this guy dominating the airwaves, right? There's so many other things going on. We got to move him down from his pedestal. There's a lot of other things that maybe should be getting more attention. And I can see something to a degree similar happening here, right? Like if something big that's bad happens, think about when there are like a school shooting or something. The event stays front and center for a little while, but a lot of news outlets take the deliberate choice to not mention the shooter by name because they don't want that person to get any more notoriety, any more fame. So I could kind of see that making sense here. But it's interesting that for a 5-week stretch or something, they just completely removed Prigozhin's name from everything. They say after this whole mutiny thing kind of settled down, Prigozhin instructed the Wagner troops in Belarus to prepare for a new journey to Africa, where French intelligence estimated around 4,000 Wagner mercenaries were already stationed. Again, it makes sense. It looked like in Belarus, the role, and there's been videos and pictures to show this, but the Wagner role in Belarus is training Belarusian military forces. And I'm sure there's a nice contract there. And, I'm sure that keeps them, relatively tied in with the Russian Ministry of Defense. But the money's in Africa. It was not crazy that Prigozhin looks at this and he's like, we got the people, we got the manpower, let's get them over to where, we're actually turning a pretty big profit. Again, it's a for-profit entity at the end of the day, right? They continue, American officials said Prigozhin also sought to squeeze new profits from his extensive African ventures, which have introduced military, commercial, and propaganda activities in numerous countries. Wagner's operations bolstered tottering military regimes, traded in diamonds, gold, and lumber, spread disinformation, and even made movies to glorify their exploits. There was a Wagner movie that came out, I think it was at Bakhmut. I think it was Wagner that put it together, or at least an organization affiliated with Wagner. I haven't seen that one. But I'd be interested in seeing some of these African glory military movies that they're putting together. That's got to be interesting. So moving on to the actual death of Prigozhin, the plane crash, mysterious plane crash. They say that the fact that the mercenary group's 3 top leaders had boarded the same plane stunned Mr. Shugaly. Remember, this is the kind of political advisor to Prigozhin, so kind of an inside man for Wagner. He said that the men never traveled together to allow for an ordinary succession after an attack. Not crazy, right? The president and vice president don't fly in the same plane. You split it out a little bit. It sounds like Prigozhin and his leadership followed the same protocols, except for this one time when their plane went down. Shugaly said, quote, 3 key people who never gathered together for certain reasons because each could replace the other if it came to it, got on the same plane. To me, this is the main mystery. It is a mystery, for sure. It also could just be a sloppy mistake, overconfidence, Prigozhin not understanding maybe the risk he was in, or any number of things. The more we hear about how Prigozhin was acting shortly after this mutiny, it really seems like he felt relatively invincible. But getting into where this whole Wagner dynasty thing will go, some agree that Pavel Prigozhin, Prigozhin's son, who's in his 20s, will indeed try to assert control over his father's company. I guess Pavel's been sanctioned by the United States. He owns some real estate companies in Russia. I haven't heard anything about this guy. I haven't seen any pictures of him. That's going to be quite the task in your 20s to pick up a global mercenary organization and all of their business dealings around the globe. But personal opinion, I think this is going to become very heavily managed by the Russian state. But they continue saying American officials now say there are a dozen private companies that could also become involved in overseeing paramilitary operations. They point to various PMCs that could absorb the fighters and different operations, things like that. Wagner's not the only PMC in Russia. There's a bunch of them. Wagner's happens to be, partially because of Prigozhin's kind of flamboyant attitude, Wagner is one of the most well-known and at this point best resourced and largest. But there are a lot of others, that could fit this mold, that technically could follow in Wagner's footsteps and take over their tasks. They say there's still a strong market in Africa's weakest countries for Wagner's central offering, regime protection. And the demise of Mr. Prigozhin has only whetted the appetite of some African countries for a stronger relationship with the Kremlin, especially those previously wary of Wagner, like Burkina Faso. And that, to me, you look back through some of the interactions just after the mutiny and before Prigozhin was killed, there were Russian leaders. And the article gets into this, but there were some Russian military leaders and intelligence leaders traveling across Africa, starting to make those connections with leaders of these various African countries. It just seems like that's where things are headed. It makes sense. This got so messy with Prigozhin, the private entity, all of a sudden taking the limelight and then turning that limelight against the people. Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov, who essentially kind of empowered him and allowed Prigozhin to stay in power, if you will, and to maintain this empire. That backfired so much. I would be surprised if it ends up being an individual, not overtly state-controlled. I would believe that individual would be handpicked by Putin and people within the Russian government to know that they're very friendly with the Kremlin. Second to that, I'd say it's entirely likely that these assets almost become branches of the SVR and the GRU. But like that one unnamed American official in this article said, it is far too soon to know what actually happens with this entire Wagner entity. They still have fighters, mercenaries all around the world that are technically being paid and work for the Wagner Group. A lot of their disinformation campaign networks, all that stuff is still in place working for Wagner. But there's no clear leader of the organization. That just can't continue for long. So be interesting to see how it shakes out. But that's all I got for now. If you're interested in national security subjects, be sure to check out the SITREP. I put out once a week. Link is in the description below. It's direct to your inbox, 7 to 10 articles with links out to a bunch of different sources so you can investigate them or read more about it yourself, and a couple podcast recommendations if there happen to be some that week. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.